Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. We are excited to offer 2 starting levels of professional trainings designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is a psychoeducational training designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. The Level 2 NARM Therapist training is a comprehensive clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, as well as current mental health graduate students and clinical interns and trainees. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. And now for our interview. Dr. Daniel Schiff is a psychologist in private practice with 45 years of clinical experience in the practice of somatic psychotherapy from a Reichian Gestalt perspective. As director of the Somatic Psychotherapy Training Institute, located in Portland, Oregon, he teaches an introductory course in somatic psychotherapy, a 4-year training program in contemporary orgone therapy, and provides clinical supervision for therapists. Please enjoy this conversation with Brad Kammer and Dr. Daniel Schiff.
All right, Dan, welcome to Transforming Trauma. So happy to have you.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I was telling you a little bit about why I invited you. I am a huge Reichian fan and big influence in my career. And some of our mutual colleagues and friends told me that you do great work with some of the roots of Reichian therapy. And I'm excited for us to explore this together.
Great. I've been involved in Reich's work for over 45 years, maybe more. So I love talking about it. So we're in the same space then.
This is great. I'm really excited. So let's just start with just letting folks know who you are, your background, and then we can start going deeper.
Very quickly, I'm a psychologist. I live and work in Portland, Oregon, but I've been another part of my life, mostly in Seattle, Washington, but originally from the East Coast. And let's say I've been practicing for 47 years and teaching Reich's work for about 3 decades. But I got involved with Reich very early on when I started working as just an undergraduate, when I started working with kids. I got involved in humanistic psychology and also psychodynamic therapy. And somewhere in there, and of course, I think it was through Gestalt Therapy, I came across Reich. And as you may know, or people may know, Reich was very influential in the development of Gestalt Therapy in terms of the relation between Reich and Pearls. And so I learned about Reich, and then there was something about his work that really appealed to me. And I started reading his work, I started getting into therapy, and then went for my master's in 1970, 75 or something like that. I did a master's dissertation on Reich's work, and then my doctorate work was on emotional repression and respiration, because the breathing and emotions are something very important to Reich's work. So I've been following Reich's work for a long time and teaching and integrating what's been current and evolving in the field of understanding human behavior and physics and all those things in the development of Reich's work. Because Reich himself was always developing things, always integrating things, always advancing his theory. So it only makes sense that if he died in the late 50s, he'd want his work to evolve over time and not stand still, as most good work does.
Exactly. Well, that's great. That's exactly why I wanted to have you on, because, we look at some of our roots being from Reichian work and the NARM model. And the founder, the creator of NARM, his name's Dr. Lawrence Heller. He's a contemporary of yours. And in the early 70s, he also got into the same field. He, I think, opened the first Gestalt Institute of Colorado, and he was doing bioenergetics. And so there's a lot of alignment here. And maybe just for people that don't know that much about Reich, I mean, this is going to be hard in 2 minutes or so, but Let's just talk a little bit about Wilhelm Reich and his work, and then how that influenced, like you said, Gestalt and the whole field of somatic psychology.
Okay, well, I'll try to do it in 2 minutes, but it might take three. It might actually take three. Okay, so very quick in a nutshell, Reich was a younger analyst in the 1920s. Psychoanalyst, was one of the younger people who was considered like advancing in the psychoanalytic field. And he began to observe that psychoanalysis really wasn't working that well, and because people were not really accessing their emotions, their feelings. And he began to look at the whole idea of the relationship of repression of emotions or feelings or excitation or energy with what he called the character structure, the way the person moves, thinks, operates in the world, the total personality of the person, not just psychological things like repression or denial or whatever, but essential holistic way of being in the world was a way of regulating your emotions and your feelings and your energy and your sexual energy and your life energy. So he developed this thing called character analysis, which became very important in psychoanalysis. And many people studied that. One who was Fritz Perls, who developed Gestalt Therapy. And Laura Perls as well, Fritz Perls' wife, who was also involved with the character analytic movement in Germany at that time, which was right around the war, right before the war. And then Reich became very interested in not only how people move, but the relationship between the muscular system and the biophysical system, the body, and the repression of feeling and emotion. And especially sexuality, because he felt sex was just like a life energy. Sex is the way through which we kind of contact. And in fact, most things are sexual because sex has to do with pleasure and moving and reaching toward the environment. So he began to see that we inhibit our feelings and emotions and sensations and stuff through our bodies, through inhibiting our respiration, through tightening muscles, preventing emotions, which are physical phenomena, to actually happen by preventing it, by tightening it. So he developed that thing and he called it Gestalt Therapy. And then he began to try to explore what the actual origins of anxiety and movement of energy were. So he began to study elemental life forms such as protozoa and amoeba, and he moved into his much more scientific realm. And it was in that process, that he came across an experience and contact with what he felt was a different kind of energy. And he called that orgone energy, life energy. And he began to study that. So when he left Europe to come to the United States in early 40s, he developed an institute and working around teaching a therapy that was built upon character analysis and the work with the body and the discovery of orgone energy, and began to study orgone energy. So he called his therapy orgone therapy. And what it meant really, and where I think it really fits, is that essentially when you're working with people, you're working with their life energy and how it moves and how it blocks, how it expresses itself and how we inhibit ourselves based upon the social conditions in which we were raised, the emotion scripts that we developed, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're helping a person engage the world more and dealing with the blocks, you're dealing with blocks to energy. So he called it orgone energy, and he developed an institute on the East Coast called Organon, which he was looking and working with the energy and also doing atmospheric studies. So he really shifted a lot from working as a psychologist and a psychiatrist, more of a psychiatrist, to becoming like a researcher, but integrating that into his therapeutic work.
That was incredible. Anyone that knows anything about Reich knows how sophisticated he was and his teachings were. So doing that in 3 or 4 minutes is incredible. One of the things that we talk a lot about is how Reich was often considered the grandfather or founder of somatic psychology. I mean, I think one of the areas of disagreement he had with Freud was that he really believed that this libido energy, this life energy, lived in the body, which is what he later talked about as orgone. And he did initially, some touch work and, like you said, working with breath. And In terms of the development of where we are now in 2023 with somatic psychology, what's your sense about some of the ways that his roots of his work has evolved and influenced all these different approaches? Like even EMDR, people don't know that Reich was doing work with the eyes 80 years ago. And Francine Shapiro, is thought of as the founder of EMDR, but Reich was doing very similar work to what she developed 50 years after he had been doing it. So just curious about your perspective about the evolution of.
First of all, there's somatic psychology and somatic psychotherapies, and there are those that are popular in the United States, and there are those that are popular more in Europe and then in Latin America, and they have a different kind of colors to them. So I'll stay with the United States, more so because I know that more, seeing that I live here. I think there are some therapies that are actually evolved from Reich's work, Gestalt Therapy for sure, and that was, clearly marked. Bioenergetic analysis by Alexander Lowen, that clearly. And that influenced a lot of neo-Reichian therapies. Hakomi actually seems to have taken some aspects from Reich's work, again, Rolfing initially, and so on and so forth. Peter Levine's work. Peter Levine worked and was trained in Reichian therapy. So that's a direct route. And many of his ideas about the way we deal with trauma and the way that, we stop ourselves and then we have to complete actions and so on are very similar to what Reich was writing in character analysis, again, in the 30s. So there's some direct lines. But there are others that don't seem to be as direct. And I think some of those that maybe come more from, like EMDR you mentioned. I'm not really sure how much Shapiro actually knew about Reich and whether or not her ideas actually emerged from Reich or just emerged because there was a growing awareness of the possibility of that. And actually EMDR works with the eyes very differently than Reich did. EMDR originally with working with the eyes was, a way of moving back and forth, kind of moving into a more of a state that is more REM oriented, that allowed you to go into certain kind of imagery. And Reich's work with eyes are much more in terms of contacting the environment, feeling the movement, feeling the sensations, being in the here and now in your eyes. So your eyes can express the emotions, can show your interest, your fear, your anger, all those things. So they worked with the eyes differently. Does it then, because the eyes are windows to the soul and the brain, did it lead to similar kind of connections in the brain? And yeah, maybe. But their approach to the eyes is very different. So I'm not so sure that that's one of them. And I think currently there's also some of the somatic work here kind of focuses on trauma and kind of comes from the trauma literature and how trauma affects the organism. But Reich was not really coming from a trauma perspective. He was coming from a character perspective. He was coming from how we form our personalities in the world, how our social systems become ingrained into us. So in a sense, it has a little different flavor to it, even though our systems can traumatize ourselves or traumatize us, and we're dealing with a lot of the same dynamics. So I think there are commonalities and differences. I don't know if that helps at all. Or...
It's really helpful. I mean, one of the things Reich I know talked a lot about is about parenting and how that impacts child development. Yes. And I know in some of your research and your teaching, you've talked about attachment. And NARM really, our model focuses much more on developmental and relational trauma versus kind of more shock trauma elements.
But does your approach when you say relational trauma, like if there's a message in the family, don't cry, because crying is really demeaning. Is that considered a relational trauma?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's two ways I think about it. One is more of like an academic way or theoretical way of answering it. And then one is about the personal response to it. But I mean, the theoretical or academic is when things are pervasive in the field and consistent over the course of time. If a child isn't able to bring their authentic self out and there's some kind of threat of fear that they're going to lose the attachment relationship or feel ashamed for themselves, then I think that does start to fall into that category of more relational or emotional trauma.
Okay, so that would fit within that schema. Yes.
Yeah, and that's partly why I wanted to talk to you too, because it's like, I don't know, I don't think that Reich ever used that word trauma.
Probably not.
Yeah. But it seems like his model was so aligned with how, like you mentioned, Gestalt, of course, and Hakomi, and NARM is similar to those models and has a lot of roots in them. Just how we look at we call them adaptive survival styles, but the language was character structure, character styles, and how those were developmentally created. I mean, those were different developmental needs at different developmental stages that then impacted the body and the character in different ways.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so Gestalt therapy, is that your kind of home? Is that what you call yourself more, or what do you?
No.
Okay.
Well, I say I do contemporary orgone therapy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I want to stick with Reich because Reich developed a system of working characterologically and somatically.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole idea in that of working. He had an idea and understanding about how emotions move in the body, idea of working with what he called biophysical segments, and a kind of structuring, not a rigid structuring in any way, but a structuring in terms of how you begin to help a person de-armor or reduce armor, being that protective, characterological, physical way of protecting ourselves and holding our emotions and protecting from the outside. He had a kind of structure to it and a way that he was utilizing respiration, not only in the terms of regulating, like learning how to use respiration to regulate your emotions, to stay within a window of tolerance, but use your respiration to free it up so it's natural. So that for each emotion, the corresponding respiratory pattern emerges because that's what supports us. That's what energizes us. That's part of it, a part of that whole emotional movement. So because of that, and that's something I've really taken to and really works well, at least for me, I stay with that form. However, I include many things that were developed afterwards. One, Gestalt, which was kind of developed afterwards or concurrently. And I think Gestalt really works well in terms of the interpersonal contact and the whole idea of contact and contact functions. In a sense, Gestalt works with these characterological ideas, but took the terminology and changed it from a more psychoanalytic early terminology that Reich was using to just more here and now process terminology. And I think that fits. I think that fits better for Reich. So I use a lot of that. I also use more contemporary psychoanalytic work, like interpersonal psychodynamic work and self-psychology and attachment theory. And attachment theory, of course, was later on in Reich's life, he became much more interested when he had his son about early child development. And he began to comment on things that would really fit very well with attachment fear, contact, emotional needs, the earliest expressions of the infant that move toward contact and the way the environment has to meet that. So he was really onto these things, but was onto many other things and didn't have time to research many things.
No, he was so ahead of his time. It's incredible. Yeah. So many pathways that he didn't even fully be able to go down to develop. And people don't know that he passed away very young. I mean, he was only his late 50s.
Yeah, he was 60.
Oh, he was 60. Okay.
He was 60, and he died in prison.
He died in prison. Yeah.
He died in prison. Yeah. He was put into prison for his work, which, he came to the United States to flee Nazi Germany. He ended up in prison.
And they burned his books too. Yeah.
And they burned his books. There's a lot of, if any of the listeners here are really interested in Reich's work, it's a fascinating history. Very fascinating history. It's a tragic history. In some regards. Yeah.
Yeah. He thought of himself a lot in in some of these early scientists who were burned at the stake and stuff in the Middle Ages. Yeah. And he really was ahead of his time in our society in Europe before our American society had trouble evolving with his work, and he even tried to communicate with Einstein. I mean, there's some great stories about,
Yeah.
but okay, so let's go back to your work. So you said you use respiration. So a lot of people that listen are either therapists or people that are interested in therapy. So let's talk about, like, if a client comes in and has anxiety or depression, they want to work with you. How do you actually start using respiration and breath work in your work?
Well, first of all, one key principle is that therapy is very different for every person, because every person is an individual, and therapy emerges from the contact and the interaction. So if a person comes in with anxiety and depression, that could be a total different presentation from one person to another. Yes, the symptoms of anxiety are the same, the symptoms, but where it comes from and how it manifests itself is very, very different. But given that, one of the ways that Reich was working, which I continue to work when I can, I mean, it's a little more difficult on Zoom and through the video land, is people would lay down. And then he brought that, of course, from psychoanalysis. And when he was working as a psychoanalyst, people were laying down. And then when he developed character analysis, well, that was in psychoanalysis. People were still laying down. So when he developed orgone therapy, people were still laying down. So I have people lay down. They lay down on a mattress or whatever, and I get to see, and I look at their respiration. And I see where the respiration is held and how they breathe. Is there a wave of respiration? Does the respiration full, and does it encompass not only movements of the chest and abdomen and diaphragm, but the whole body? The whole body breathes. The body is kind of like, it works in a wave. And the whole body breathes. If you go, notice if you do that, you move forward. Your shoulders give over. Your neck relaxes. The whole body breathes. And in that whole body breathing, there are sensations, like a letting go, a feeling of maybe energy or movement. Reich called it streaming sensations when you let down. Okay. So I look at how a person breathes and how they hold themselves, and how they talk, what the sound of their voice is, all these somatic aspects. And then, I'm correlating that with why they're in therapy. What did they come for? If they came from anxiety, what is the relationship between the way they hold themselves and the way they're breathing and the way they're lying on the mattress, couch, and their anxiety? And then I might say, can you breathe a little deeper? Would you be willing to breathe a little? And then I begin to see what happens as they begin to breathe. What moves, what doesn't move, but also what they feel and how they react. And from an orgonomic Reichian work, as you breathe, which is bringing energy into the system or emotions, because you can't really have a real emotional feeling and expression without a breath to it. Try to do many things while holding your breath. You're going to find it's a little hard. So as a person breathes, how do they react? Do they feel, this is great? Or they space out? Or they hardly breathe at all? Or they breathe like a machine? Or they breathe only in their upper chest? Or they start feeling very, very anxious? Or they start feeling bored? Or they think about something, or they have an emotional thought. So all those things start to happen as a person starts to breathe, and that begins to reveal how a person has organized themselves in the world around their feelings, sensations, and emotions. And what is brought up and what emerges is then worked with. So a person becomes very spacey. I'm very, very spacey. Okay. Why don't you stop breathing right now and let's make a little contact here. Okay. Or if a person starts obsessing about something. Okay, well, was that related to your breathing? Can you just focus on your breathing right now? Or if a person starts feeling scared, we work with that. That's how it works. The breathing becomes an avenue for the movement of energy, of feelings and emotions. And then that becomes an avenue of exposing how a person organizes around those emotions. And that becomes an avenue of beginning to address those particular patterns and what's underneath it. With the goal of eventually, and this is the eventual thing that may never happen, that a person lays down and breathes and just feels really good. Because we have, all of us, have this capacity to feel really good. Just like children, they wake up in the morning, they're ready to play and feel good.
Yeah, full vitality, full flow. Yeah.
Full flow, that's the word, good word, and vitality. Yes, exactly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much. And I'm curious, do you also do touch work in your work? Do you use your hands? Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I did when I was working.
Before Zoom.
But yes. And then the touch work, the way I use touch work is for a number of things. One is to make contact. Hold my hand, make contact. Two, sometimes the muscles get very tight because that's part of the armor. Reich spoke about the armor. Part of the armor is very tight. Touch can help the person make contact with that armor. Like, okay, feel your I'm going to touch your shoulders. Feel it. I'm going to press in a little bit. Can you feel it? No, I don't feel anything. Or it hurts a lot or whatever. To make contact with the tension. Two, another way is the touch can be used to help movement. Like I might put my hand on a person's chest and say, exhale, and I'll just push down a little. Can you allow yourself? So holding a person's head and allowing the head to relax a little bit. Or pressing at times deeply into a muscle to get the muscle to respond and the person to respond. So there's different ways of using touch, but touch is always used with a lot of contact, with a lot of connection with the person. And the places that you touch really have to do with where you see the armor.
Where you see the respiration or the streaming blocked, basically.
Right, which is blocked in the armor.
Yeah, exactly.
In the armor.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And you talked about the segmental armoring that Reich used to talk about in the body.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. By segmental meaning segments, like the spine has segments, different segments of spine. He would speak about the segments of the body, like the eyes, the mouth, the throat, the chest, the diaphragm, the abdomen, the pelvis and legs, arms and chest, and how emotion flows up and down like that. And then something can get stuck, like our chest can go like this and stay inflated. And if it stays inflated, the emotion can't move. So the emotion of crying, say, if your chest is up, how can you cry? You can cry a little bit, but you can't go. So that's a segment. Mm-hmm. Or the voice doesn't come out, mm-hmm. or the eyes. So yes, mm-hmm. it's the flow of movement of emotion in those segments. Yeah.
One of the things I've been really curious about, I've been in the somatic world for over 20 years now, is just like the progression of how in the earlier days, probably when you were coming into the field, the models were more kind of cathartically based. Yes. Primal Scream, of course, is an example of that. And now I was also trained in Somatic Experiencing with Peter Levine, and the models are more kind of, at least the ones that I've been trained in, tend to be more kind of containment-based versus discharge-based or expressively based. And I wonder if you have an opinion or perspective on that.
Well, one of the things I've noticed over my career is that pendulums swing. Mm-hmm. So we go from one to another side. I think some of the real cathartic, expressive kind of therapies went a little overboard and didn't really understand trauma and didn't understand dysregulation and didn't understand how the organism has to learn to regulate. So we needed this other side. But I think personally, this other side is too much on another side. Mm. Doesn't include enough of the expressiveness that is really necessary for the word you use, vitality. So I think both are necessary. It's part of, Reich would speak about this ergonomic functionalism or this dialectic, that things get split, but they're really part of something similar. So the movement of energy The movement in the organism both needs to be regulated, but it needs to be expressed. It needs to have force, and it needs to also have calmness. And you need both elements to it. And I think the pendulum has swung, in my impression, toward one side. And hopefully, I think they'll come back and integrate the more expressive movements. And I think that's also around the emotion of anger. Like anger, from Reich's perspective, and he writes very directly about that, as it's written in Gestalt work, anger is a very important emotion. It's a very important emotion to engage the world, to lead to assertion, to protect ourselves, to have boundaries, to have a sense of I, to fight against resistance. I think there's probably a lot of anger in Ukraine right now, and needed anger. Okay. So anger is necessary if it's regulated, if it's focused. But we can move, I think, a little bit in the field where anger is more seen as defensive or a part of dysregulation. And you have to kind of contain it or down-regulate it. And I think that's true in many regards, but it's only part of a story. So that's my sense. I think we've kind of swung. You've expressed that swung, but hopefully we'll swing a little bit back and have a pulsation. The pulsation, when you need one, when you need the other. That was Reich's idea, is that you have this pulsation, which is very functional, meaning that it really relates to what is needed in the environment and based upon your context.
Yeah, the charge, discharge, the contraction, expansion. And
exactly, yes. The being with, the being not.
Yeah.
Contact, withdrawal, and Gestalt.
I've been noticing, I'm sure you have been too, there's been a very strong interest in the last 5 or 10 years of psychedelic medicine and plant medicine. And
yes,
some of them they're all different, but I think a lot of people have been interested in ayahuasca and things like this. And I almost think that that's part of maybe a swinging back in the pendulum in a certain way, that these experiences tend to be much more expressive and discharge oriented. So maybe there's part of the movement already happening right there. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
One thing I'd love to talk to you about, because this is something that just in my teaching and a lot of my colleagues are bumping up against this. Being a somatic oriented therapist, the current time that we're living in, we're not very accepted in traditional psychotherapy or psychology. Evidence-based has become kind of taken over everything. And so, and there's a whole political process about how you become evidence-based. So a lot of the somatic models are not accepted as evidence-based approaches. And, you've been in this field a long time. I wonder if you have any perspective on, for those of us that are kind of in the trenches trying to bring this important work to clients and communities, how do we navigate some of the challenges that we're having to address?
Well, I wish I had an answer for you. I mean, Reich's work and my work, well, I'll say Reich's work has always been marginalized.
Yeah.
Reich has been marginalized. So I think a lot of the things have that come from it and work from it become marginalized. And now, as you say, evidence-based, that's another thing. I mean, you only have evidence if you research something. If you only have research something, if there's money and funds and interest to research. So I think that becomes a difficulty. But I think, I don't know, my sense, though, is that there's more acceptance now of this kind of stuff because of trauma, and because of the influence of trauma work. Many more psychologists or therapists are getting trained, and maybe, in your modality and other, in this particular field, and they're being introduced to it. I think like The Body Keeps Its Score has scored tremendously in terms of bringing this knowledge into university settings and degree programs and whatever. So I think it's coming into the field. And I think in terms of evidence, the evidence regarding what happens in trauma, as maybe you know better than I, the evidence is totally in terms of how it all affects the autonomic nervous system and it affects of how you have to deal with the body in order to help the person begin to regulate themselves and deal with trauma. So I'm more optimistic about that because I come maybe from an earlier place where I thought, when I was younger, I thought everybody when people would read Reich, psychotherapy would go totally toward Reich and humanistic ideas and Gestalt. And then cognitive behaviorism came and just kind of the big foot on everything, and turned the whole relationship between affect and cognition on its head. But there's been a reversal. So I feel positive about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think traditionally this country tends to have challenges with depth.
Yeah.
And so Reich's work has, I think, largely been much more popular over the years in Europe because there's more access to that. But you're right. I also think about just like 25 years ago, things like yoga and meditation were still very fringe. And now they're completely accepted. So, there's also that where people, us sitting here talking for 30 minutes about breathing 20 years ago might have sounded very strange from a therapist, but now people are doing that every day in yoga class. So
Right. That's right. That's right. So when you look at that, it shows to me in this queer trend that this is happening. So I think the body is increasingly being integrated with the mind. And of course, Reich's big thing was there's no split between the psyche and soma.
Exactly.
That whole idea is what he continually challenged. We're one organism.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to make sure we cover before we wrap up is really inspired by the way that you were talking before. And I've read a little bit about some of the work that you do before about how much working in the present moment seems like a very central focus for the way you work. And again, that's very aligned with our model. And, because a lot of people who come into our trainings are very focused on content and history and even getting symptoms and disorders. And for us, so much of it is about really working with the patterns that are showing up in real time. And I wonder if you could speak more from your perspective around how you work in the present moment.
Well, first of all, from a theoretical perspective, Reich was very clear that the past exists in the present. The history is in the organism right now and how we function right now. That's where he developed this whole idea of character analysis. You see what you work with, what's presented in front of you. So it only makes sense because it's in the right now that the aliveness is there. So symptoms come from the character structures, and the character structures live in the present. So when I teach this work, and I attempt when I do this work to, as you're saying, really help people focus not so much on what the person is saying, though that's important, but in addition, how they're saying it, how they're relating it to you, and what's the music behind it. Is it static? Is it vibrant? Is there flux and flow? Is it flat? Whatever. How congruent is what they're saying with their presentation? Are they talking about something that's really frightening in a deadpan voice? Are they smiling as they're staring at you with hateful eyes? What's happening in the present, I try to help a person focus on as living material of the past. And then as you focus and help the person orient to the present, the past comes to the foreground, and then they can integrate the past. Rather than the past is something in the past and you talk about from the past, or you come in and talk about things that happen. Well, I did this and I did this today and that today, or yesterday and today. But how does that live in the immediacy? How is the person expressing? So that becomes very, very central Gestalt, but central for Reich in his work. And how you, as a therapist, experience all of this in your own organism.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Do you have a practice for yourself or any tips for us about what you've learned in your course of your career?
Just pay attention and feel and breathe, and get out of your head. And if you're in your head, meaning thinking, have that connected to your body. And don't, as a therapist, don't be rigid. And don't be overly attentive, but be willing to take the person in and flow with the person. It's a lot, and I think that's why it's important for all therapists to do work on themselves.
Yeah.
To really be able to feel the things that they need to feel so that they can feel with the person that they're with.
Yeah. Again, if we're going to give all these shout outs to Reich, I think he said something in the line of, you can't take someone to some place that you haven't been to yourself. Just really exploring all this territory inside ourselves is helping professionals as therapists so that we can take people to some of these places that can be pretty scary for humans.
Yeah, sure. And for us. And be scary for us as we are with them.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to hold that, the tragedy that we can hear and feel and meet them, because part of what's healing is how the person is met by the other person, how they're reflected in the other person's face and eyes and tone and whatever. And if we can't feel that, then the person is not going to be met, and we can do any technique up on the sun and have them breathe 1,000 times, but it ain't going to mean anything.
Yeah. So my last question for you is just like, as we think about the next generation, and I know you teach a lot, but what are some things you'd like to transmit to the younger generation that are now learning somatic work and trauma work? And what would be some of your tips of wisdom to pass along?
Okay, well, recently, one tip of wisdom is read some of the older writers. Okay, there's so much new stuff and good stuff, but most people have not read Reich. They haven't read Lowen. Okay, they haven't read the original texts in Gestalt Therapy. They haven't read some of that stuff. They haven't read some of the earlier humanistic psychologists. They haven't, that I'd say read some of that, because that was written in a different language, and some of the language might be off-put, but there was a sentiment, there was a feeling, there was a zeitgeist there that I think should be brought in and captured. So that would be one of the first things I'd say. Read broadly across the history of psychology.
If I could share a personal story about my coming in to become a therapist.
Yeah.
I was in India. I met some guy I think he was from Germany or Austria, and he was carrying around a Reich book. And I believe it was The Function of the Orgasm, one of Reich's most famous books. And, his work, as you know, is so dense, and I was not a therapist yet or a psychologist. So I just read a few, maybe a chapter or so. And I was I can almost feel it now. My whole body lit up, and I just felt like I need to know this person and I need to know their work. Yeah. And that set me on a course that really brought me into somatic psychology. And his books, they're very difficult to read, but they're so powerful. And lots of others ones. As you were talking, I was thinking about Carl Rogers' work. A lot of people haven't read some of his original work. There's so many that we could go through, but it's just great stuff.
There's a lot of riches. Yeah, and do read Reich, even though if you're into somatic work, read Reich.
Yeah. And the suggestions I got, which was good, is to read his original work, not the work written about him, because there's some distortions in the way that it's been transmitted.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Sure. Well, this has been such a pleasure. For listeners that are interested in your work and learning more about you, how would you suggest they?
Like everybody these days, you just go to my website, but not like everybody. I don't have Facebook and I don't have these things. I guess I'm a little too old. I don't have yet. But I am up in the world of websites. So I have a website, and I have something called the Somatic Psychotherapy Training Institute, Pacific Northwest. And that's where I teach courses in somatic, and particularly though trainings in Reich's work, contemporary orgone Reichian therapy. And
great. Is that for clinicians already in the field?
Yes, clinicians or graduate students, people working.
Excellent. Great. Well, thanks so much for your time, Dan.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's nice meeting you.
Yeah, pleasure meeting you too.
Yes.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma? If so, we invite you to consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model in support of trauma-informed care. We are excited to offer psychoeducational and clinical trainings for a variety of mental health professionals. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.